What happens when a successful CEO goes undercover and faces discrimination in his own store? Saturday morning, just after 10 a.m., David Clark adjusted the brim of his baseball cap in the rearview mirror. The man staring back at him was barely recognizable. Not the CEO who had built a multi-million-dollar retail empire, but just another face in the crowd. His plain hoodie and jeans were a far cry from the tailored suits that normally defined his days. Today wasn't about boardrooms or numbers. It was about stepping into his own world unannounced. David had always believed in the power of connection. His company had been built on the promise that every customer mattered, no matter their background. But recently, whispers of complaints had started trickling up the chain, rumors of poor service, bias, and a lack of care from his staff. If there was truth to these claims, he needed to know, not as the boss, but as someone living it. The retail store in question sat just outside Dallas, Texas, in a busy suburban plaza. It wasn't the flagship location, nor was it the top-performing store in his chain, but this location held significance. It was the first store David had opened outside his home state, a gamble that had paid off handsomely. He'd visited countless times in its early days, but now, years later, he couldn't help but wonder, had the warmth and inclusivity he'd envisioned stayed intact? David parked his car and took a deep breath. A rush of anticipation mixed with unease settled over him. He was about to walk into the unknown, shedding the safety net of his title to see if his values still held weight at the foundation of his business. The truth, however uncomfortable, was something he owed to himself and to every person who walked through those doors. But what David didn't know was that his commitment to uncovering the truth would lead him to a moment he'd never forget, one that would challenge everything he thought he knew about his own business. David stepped out of his car and into the bustling parking lot. The sun was already high, casting sharp reflections off the windshields of nearby vehicles. He adjusted the strap of his weathered canvas bag, the kind you'd see slung over the shoulder of an everyday shopper. Today, he wasn't David Clark, CEO. He was just another customer, with a name no one needed to know. The storefront gleamed in the sunlight, the logo bold and familiar. He couldn't help but feel a swell of pride as he approached the automatic doors. This was his creation, a vision turned reality. But pride quickly gave way to focus as he crossed the threshold. The cool blast of air conditioning welcomed him inside. The store hummed with activity. Shoppers pushed carts laden with goods, and children's voices rose and fell in excitement near the toy aisle. Employees in uniform moved with purpose, stocking shelves, ringing up purchases, and assisting customers. To the untrained eye, everything seemed to run like clockwork. But David wasn't here to glance over the surface. He was here to dig deeper. He paused near a display of brightly colored kitchen appliances, taking in his surroundings. A young woman in a striped uniform jacket stood nearby, chatting with a customer about product features. The stock associate rearranged items on a nearby shelf, his movements efficient but detached. And there, at the far end of the store, stood a younger man, leaning against the counter of the electronics section, idly scrolling on his phone. David decided to head in that direction. He wandered through the aisles, deliberately moving at the pace of a casual shopper. He picked up a pair of headphones, turning them over in his hands as though considering a purchase. It was a test, simple yet telling. Would this employee approach him, offer assistance, a smile, anything? But nothing came. The young man barely glanced up from his phone, let alone acknowledged his presence. David waited, giving the employee every opportunity to engage. Still, nothing. He felt an uncomfortable knot begin to form in his stomach. But he wasn't ready to draw conclusions just yet. Maybe the employee was busy. Maybe he hadn't noticed. David moved on, scanning the aisles, observing interactions. He caught sight of an older woman looking for help near the home goods section. She seemed frustrated, glancing around for assistance. Before David could step in to see how it unfolded, a second employee approached her, cheerful and attentive. Relief softened her features as they began to chat. It was a stark contrast to what he had just experienced, but as David turned back toward the electronics counter, determined to give the young man another chance, what happened next would make it clear that this wasn't just a one-off oversight. It was something much bigger. David Clark returned to the electronics counter, this time holding a boxed set of Bluetooth speakers. He placed the box on the counter gently, the kind of action that should naturally catch someone's attention. The young employee finally looked up, his expression blank and uninterested. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone making it clear that he wasn't particularly interested in helping. David Clark smiled, hoping to diffuse the awkward energy. "Yeah, I was wondering if you could tell me a bit more about these. Are they good for outdoor use?" The employee gave the box a cursory glance before shrugging. "I don't know, probably," he said, his attention drifting back toward his phone. David Clark blinked momentarily, taken aback. "Could you maybe check? I want to be sure before I buy them." The employee sighed heavily, as if David Clark's request was a monumental inconvenience. Without a word, he grabbed the box, flipped it over, skimmed the back, and handed it back. "It says here, they're weatherproof," he mumbled, handing it back without further explanation. David Clark felt a wave of frustration rise within him, but kept his voice calm. "Okay, and do you know if they're compatible with most devices?" The employee rolled his eyes. "Look, man, all the details are right here on the box. You can read it yourself." He motioned vaguely toward the shelf. "Or pick something else, doesn't matter to me." A heavy silence hung between them, broken only by the distant hum of the store. David Clark could feel the tension creeping into his own posture. This wasn't just inattentiveness, it was outright dismissiveness. He glanced around, noticing other customers being treated with warmth and enthusiasm by employees. A white couple near the front was getting personalized assistance from the same young man who had helped the older woman earlier. Yet here he was, barely being acknowledged. Determined to remain composed, David Clark decided to test the situation further. "You seem busy," he said, trying to keep his tone neutral. "Is there someone else who might be able to help?" The employee smirked, the corners of his mouth curling with disdain. "I don't think anyone's free right now. Just figure it out, all right?" The words stung, more than David Clark expected. He wasn't angry, not yet. He was disappointed. This wasn't just a bad attitude. It was something deeper, something uglier. And it wasn't just about him. If this was how the employee treated someone he assumed was an ordinary shopper, how many others had left this store feeling the same sting of indifference before? Before David Clark could say another word, the young man turned away, grabbing his phone and walking off toward the back of the store. David Clark stood there, rooted in place, holding the box of speakers. For a moment, he considered walking out, but he quickly dismissed the thought. He wasn't done yet. But what David Clark didn't realize was that this moment of dismissiveness would soon expose something far more troubling about the culture he thought he had built. David Clark extended a hand. "David Clark," he said, watching as Brian's eyes widened in recognition. "I'm the owner of this store." The manager's composure faltered for just a moment before he recovered. "Mr. Hall, it's an honor to meet you. If I'd known you were visiting." David Clark held up a hand to stop him. "No need for formalities," he said, his tone calm but firm. "I've been walking around the store today, observing, and I have some concerns I need to address." Brian straightened, his expression shifting from surprise to cautious. "Of course, Mr. Hall. I'm happy to help however I can." "Let's talk about how your employees are treating customers," David Clark said, locking eyes with the manager. "I witnessed some troubling behavior, and I need to understand how this is happening under your watch." Brian's face flushed slightly, and for a split second he seemed unsure how to respond. He shifted from one foot to the other, visibly uncomfortable. "I'm not sure what you're referring to, Mr. Hall. Our staff is trained to be respectful and professional." "Is that so?" David Clark asked, his voice sharp. Because from what I saw today, there was a clear difference in how customers were treated. Some, like the woman at the register, were treated with kindness, while others, like myself, were dismissed without even a second thought. Brian took a deep breath, his face paling as the reality of the situation set in. I wasn't aware of any issues, but I'll look into it immediately. We certainly don't tolerate that kind of behavior. David Clark didn't let him off the hook so easily. It's not enough to just look into it. You need to understand what's happening, not just at the surface level. You need to ask yourself, why is there such inconsistency in your team? Why are there employees who are welcoming and others who are openly indifferent? Brian's expression grew more serious as he seemed to process David Clark's words. I understand what you're saying, Mr. Hall, and I'll take full responsibility for addressing this with my team. It won't happen again. Good, David Clark said, his gaze steady and unwavering. Because this isn't just about customer service. It's about the culture you're fostering. You're responsible for creating an environment that values respect, fairness, and inclusivity. As David Clark turned to leave, Brian hesitated. Mr. Hall, I promise, we'll work on this, he said. We'll ensure things improve. David Clark nodded once, his mind already moving to the next steps he needed to take. He was still determined, but he knew this would take more than a conversation with one manager. It would take consistent effort, change in leadership, and perhaps the company-wide reset that he hadn't seen coming. That's the point, Brian. You weren't supposed to know I came here as a regular customer to see how things are really running, and what I saw today, it wasn't good. Brian's face reddened slightly. I'm sorry to hear that. Can you tell me what happened? David Clark recounted the events of the day, the indifference from the electronics employee, the overheard comments, and the stark differences in how customers were treated. He spoke calmly but firmly, his words carrying the weight of disappointment. This isn't just about one bad employee, he said. It's about a culture that allows this kind of behavior to exist. I've built this company on the idea that every customer deserves respect, regardless of who they are. Today, I saw the opposite of that. Ryan shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't aware of these issues. I've always tried to ensure our team follows the company's values, he replied. David Clark nodded. I believe you. But clearly, something is slipping through the cracks. And it's not just your responsibility. It's mine too. Somewhere along the way, I've let the values I built this company on get diluted. That ends today. He asked Brian to gather the staff for an impromptu meeting in the break room. Within minutes, the employees were assembled, their faces a mix of curiosity and apprehension. David Clark stood before them, no longer just another customer, but the leader they didn't expect to see. Good afternoon, he began, his voice steady. For those of you who don't know me, my name is David Clark. I'm the founder and CEO of this company, and today I came here undercover to see how things are running on the ground. The room fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. David Clark took a moment to look at each face before continuing. What I saw today was troubling. Some of you showed kindness and professionalism, the kind of attitude this company was built on, but others failed to meet even the most basic standard of respect. And that failure isn't just on you, it's on me for not ensuring our culture stays consistent. He turned toward the young electronics employee, who now looked pale and nervous. You dismissed me, ignored me, and made it clear I wasn't worth your time. That's unacceptable. But even worse, I overheard 2 employees speaking about me, making assumptions about who I am and what I could afford based on nothing more than a glance. The tension in the room was palpable, but David Clark kept his tone measured. I'm not here to embarrass anyone. I'm here to fix this, because if we don't treat every customer with respect, we fail, and I won't let this company fail. As he stood there, watching their expressions shift from shock to reflection, David Clark knew this was only the beginning of the changes he needed to make. He paused, letting the room settle into silence. The weight of his words had landed, and now came the part that mattered most: action. He knew that pointing out the problems wasn't enough. "Here's what's going to happen," he continued, his voice calm but resolute. "This isn't about punishment or pointing fingers. It's about accountability and growth. Every single one of us, myself included, has a responsibility to uphold the values this company was built on. Starting today, we're making changes." He turned to Brian, the store manager. "First, we're going to implement mandatory training on bias and customer service, not just here, but across every store. It's not enough to assume people know how to treat others. We need to teach it, reinforce it, and hold people accountable." Brian nodded, his expression a mix of relief and determination. "Understood, Mr. Hall. I'll make sure it happens." David Clark addressed the group again. "Second, I'll be visiting more stores in person, unannounced. This isn't about catching anyone off guard. It's about staying connected. I need to see firsthand what's happening on the ground." The employees exchanged nervous glances, but there was a sense of understanding in the room. David Clark could see that some of them, especially Denise, were nodding subtly in agreement. Lastly, David Clark said, his tone softening, "I want to hear from all of you. What's working, what's not. If there are issues with leadership or policies, I need to know. My door is open, but more importantly, I'll make sure you have a way to voice concerns anonymously if you're not comfortable coming to me directly." The employees seemed to relax slightly, and David Clark took that as a sign to close on a heartfelt note. "I started this company because I wanted to create something different, something better, a place where everyone, no matter who they are, felt valued. Somewhere along the way, we lost a little of that, but I'm not giving up on it. I know we can do better, and I'm counting on all of you to help make that happen." As the meeting wrapped up, David Clark approached Denise, the cashier who had shown professionalism and kindness. "Thank you for being a bright spot today," he said, offering a genuine smile. "Your attitude reminds me why I started this business." Denise smiled back, her voice steady. "Thank you, Mr. Hall. I just try to treat people the way I'd want to be treated." Walking out of the store for the second time that day, David Clark felt a mixture of exhaustion and hope. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was necessary. He had been given a wake-up call, and now it was up to him to act on it. But as he drove away, David Clark couldn't help but feel a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that sometimes facing hard truths was the only way to move forward, and that every step toward change started with someone willing to take the first.